Besides the abolitionist press, there were many other individuals and groups who worked very hard for abolition, and they did so in a myriad of different ways. One of the more interesting of these people was Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a former slave and a very formidable speaker, and she was also a significant advocate for women's rights. Sojourner Truth spoke publicly often. She spoke publicly in gatherings that were majority white. She spoke publicly in majority gatherings of white and argued against white men. All of those things in and of themselves in the middle of the 19th century were quite extraordinary. As reported from one of her more famous lectures, Sojourner Truth, advocating for women's rights, said, "If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone," referencing the biblical Eve, "these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it, the men better let them." So Sojourner Truth was referencing for equal rights for women, and therein lied a challenge during this antebellum time of reform. For many years, there had been people who had been both suffragists and abolitionists. However, by the middle of the 19th century, some abolitionists believed that their cause's time had come, but that suffrage just was not going to happen, that women would have to wait longer for the right to vote. There was a rift between many people in the suffrage and abolitionist movement, and some significant difficulties. Of course, abolition will take place with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, but suffrage will not take place until the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, over a half century after the end of the Civil War. Harriet Tubman was probably the most historically prominent member of the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad itself was really an informal group of houses or barns or safe places, an informal and ever-changing way to travel to the north, and perhaps all the way to Canada to make sure that no slave catchers or people enforcing the Fugitive Slave Acts could catch you and take you back to slavery in the South. Harriet was known as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Again, perhaps its most famous, the escaping slaves, the passengers, the various routes, informal and ever-changing routes they used, the tracks, and so on. In West Des Moines, the closest stop on the Underground Railroad is still around today, and it's the historically important Jordan House. Going back again to the intellectual history of people that wrote things that influenced is Harriet Beecher Stowe, but Harriet Beecher Stowe is really more than just a writer, not that writing Uncle Tom's Cabin wasn't enough. To start with Harriet Beecher Stowe, one can see she's a little bit different than a lot of women in the mid-19th century just by looking at her name, Harriet Beecher Stowe. It was uncommon in the United States for women to keep a maiden name or to go with a hyphenated name in the 1950s, let alone in the 1850s. But she was a Beecher, daughter of Lyman Beecher. Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's father, was one of the leaders of the Second Great Awakening and the founder of the American Temperance Society. Her brother Henry Ward Beecher was one of the earliest and most strident abolitionists. Most of her family members were very prominent in multiple reform movements. So Harriet Beecher Stowe stands out for the way she sees herself and the way she sees her country. Her book, turned into a play, Uncle Tom's Cabin, details the brutality and the horrid nature of slavery. And this was something that many white Northerners just didn't get. They weren't aware of, they knew there was slavery in the South. They just didn't know how bad it was. But there is no doubt. There's no doubt after the publishing of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And among many things, it causes millions of Northerners, many Northerners, to stop supporting the Fugitive Slave Act, to not support the returning of runaway slaves to the South. Here then is a quote from Uncle Tom's Cabin that helps to exemplify just what kind of information it portrayed to Northerners about slavery. "But now what? Why, now comes my master. Takes me right away from my work and my friends and all I like, and grinds me down into the very dirt, And why? Because he says, I forgot who I was. He says to teach me that I am only a inward. After all, and last of all, he comes between me and my wife and says, I shall give her up and live with another woman. And all this your laws give him power to do in spite of God or man. After the Civil War started, when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he is said to have remarked to her, so, this is the little lady that wrote that book that started this war. Obviously an oversimplification, but what Lincoln was doing was saying the way you educated Northern whites about slavery, that was one of the turning points. That really got people to understand slavery must end. Perhaps, we don't know, perhaps Lincoln was self-referencing on that topic also. There were also a number of famous rebellions of people trying to end slavery. Many of these, all of the rebellions in the United States are unsuccessful, and indeed, many of them start with the knowledge that they will be crushed, they will be caught, and they will be executed. The most famous, though, of the Western Hemisphere rebellions is by Toussaint L'Ouverture in what was at that time Saint-Domingue and eventually the Free Country of Haiti in 1791. The rebellions by Gabriel Prosser, Denmark Vesey, and Nat Turner just are not successful in the United States throughout the early 19th century. Both Prosser's and Vesey's rebellions were preempted. Word got out about them and they never started. Turner's was somewhat successful. 60 white people were killed, and in retaliation over 200 slaves were killed. How Nat Turner is remembered has really varied throughout history. It was a brutal rebellion. People were murdered. Women and children even were murdered. The most traditional view is this up in the upper left-hand corner that shows runaway slaves attacking innocent women and children and males that cannot defend themselves. Here is another one that shows that the white man has a gun to the black man's head and he's just going to defend himself. Here, kind of a neo-Marxist group of Nat Turner and his followers marching on white society. This is probably the most brutal, how people were killed with axes, and it was actually axes and knives in the rebellion. And again, this shows a child with their head being chopped off. And again, one of the more interesting ones to me shows a very reflective Nat Turner holding a Bible, suggesting literacy, and holding the sword close to his chest, a well-dressed, well-coiffed man with, I'm going to follow what God says I need to do, and I will only fight if necessary. Those were the most famous of the rebellions, the ones that we have marked down in history, and were part of the attempts at abolition, but we have to understand that there were many, many informal rebellions that we will never know anything about. As slaves are shipped across the Western Hemisphere for centuries, there would have been rebellions when Africans captured Africans or Europeans captured Africans to sell them. There undoubtedly were rebellions on the ships and other rebellions throughout the places where these West Africans were forced to move to. Here we can see information from the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database that also leads us to believe that there were so many rebellions we had never heard of. That is, about a little over 11.5 million slaves were forcibly taken out of Africa, but only a little less than 10 million arrived. Almost 2 million did not make the trip. Some certainly died from the horrendous conditions on the ships, but one would have to believe that there were rebellions that were put down, that there were slaves that were executed on those ships. Also, once a slave, anytime a slave feigned illness so that they would not have to work that day or so that they would get a break, that is an informal kind of rebellion, though remembering that in these types of deals, slaves are at a terrible, significant power disadvantage compared to their owner. Anytime a slave intentionally slowed down the pace of work, that's an informal type of rebellion. But again, in this power relationship where the owner has all of the advantages, the slave was at a significant disadvantage. In any case, there are many different inputs that go into abolition, included in what eventually becomes the end of slavery, first with the Emancipation Proclamation in the states that were rebelling against the Union, and then with the ratification of the 13th Amendment.